All right, hello and welcome to our podcast. Today, this topic is going to be about the history of Title IX and some of the contemporary issues it brings, modern day issues regarding sports, going back to the origins of the Title IX, going into issues of feminism of the early 70s, Civil Rights Act, things of that sort. So before we get into it, just some formal introductions. My name is Sofranko. I'm a freshman at Slippery Rock University. My major is chemistry on a pre-physician assistant track, and I do really like history. I think it's an interesting subject. So this, project, even though it's for a final project, I think it's interesting to kind of tie the historical context into a modern day issue.
My name is Carson Pierce, also at Slippery Rock University. An exercise science major, PT. I'm going to be going over the contemporary issues and what we can do about it.
I'm Nate Pitzer, freshman at Slippery Rock University, exercise science major, pre-med, and I'm doing the impact of Title IX on sports. I'm also on the track team, so I know a thing or two.
Yeah, it's like a topic that's prevalent to your everyday, which I think is also important to note. Going back to the origins of the Title IX subject, at least for me, I knew that there were issues regarding transgender rights in modern day times with sports, NCAA, but I never really understood what the origins of all of these controversial subjects came from. So the first time I learned about Title IX was actually on campus. I saw flyers for a Riley Gaines speaker coming in to talk about Title IX. And just to kind of go and dive into what Title IX really is, I'm just going to quote. Title IX is a part of the Civil Rights Act, which I'll get a little bit more into, the relevance of that. But just to quote what the Title IX is written formally as, is no person, quote, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, end quote. All right, so I'm going to dive in a little bit to the historical context of kind of where all of this is coming from. So, sorry guys, I'm drinking water. So if I take a break, that's what it is. The Title IX was signed in 1972 under Richard Nixon, which during this point, there was kind of a delayed demand for feminist action after World War II. So, women saw different roles during World War II, working a lot more industrial based, and then soldiers come home, they're back in the houses, that's the stereotype. And then the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s gave, leeway for minority groups, especially African American populations. So going into the early 1970s, there was a really big need for emphasis on the rights of women and kind of what the government could do to support that. So Title IX is only obviously one amendment under the education movement of 1972, which was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act. A little bit more context to that. So there were multiple titles under the Civil Rights Act. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibited sex discrimination in employment, but didn't cover the education aspect, which Title IX is very heavy on the education, which, you guys, during your research, I'm sure you saw a lot more on the education side, just being with how athletics are being performed today. That's a prevalent issue today, but that really stems from, Title IX. There was certain acts put forth by the government that did reduce sex discrimination during that time of an increasing amount of feminism, but it never really covered the education aspect of that. And then you have Title IV of that same Civil Rights Act that prohibited discrimination in federally funded entities, but it didn't cover the sex discrimination aspect of that. So there was kind of gray areas in between all of these policies, and that's kind of where the Title IX came into place, kind of addressing those gaps and gray areas in between all of the ambiguity between. It's basically stressing at that point, with the historical context at the time, it really was stressing a significance on women being able to have the same educational rights as men, and with that, like intercollegiate sports allowed women and men to have same funding federally, same, if there's a men's track team, there should be a women's, which there is an example I did find of a newspaper, but I can get into that. So once again, women did face a large discrimination before Title IX, especially with funding in the sports area, because it was kind of stigma. Men get more federal funding than women, and actually, whenever the Title IX was first put forth, the NCAA actually really pushed back against this act because there was that fear of women getting more scholarships and opportunities than men's sports during that time. So I think there's a big issue. The Title IX is trying to address issues of equality, but these people thought that there was going to be an issue with equity, saying women are going to get a lot more opportunities than men.
I can add on to that. They were worried about the women stealing more scholarships and the funding, but honestly, even till this day, it hasn't changed. Women have not been compensated the same as the men have, funding, scholarships, just not really necessarily the same opportunity as the men have. So to build onto that.
Yeah. And so I'm looking at a picture right now. I just think it's interesting. Whenever I'm looking at like historical documents, I think it's interesting to see visuals. So I'm looking at a picture of Gloria Steinem and Patsy Mink. So Patsy Mink was the first Asian woman to be elected in the House. So she was a really front runner of the Title IX in general, pushing for women advocacy of feminism and equal opportunities. Gloria Steinem being a feminist during that point, still prevalent to this day with feminist issues. I just think it's interesting to see kind of like the differences you get of. I just think it's interesting, at least to see a visual of women coming out and the culture at the time, and I don't know, I just think it's interesting to look from today's point of view to then. It's definitely different. And then just to play devil's advocate against the NCAA's view of that men are going to get more scholarship than women. The Title IX is about ensuring equal opportunities for all. How does making sure women have a chance in education and sports take away from the chances of men?
Yeah.
Like, what I mean? It's just like, if the whole thing is about being equal, why are you scared that the women are getting more opportunity than the men? I just think that's an interesting question to pose.
And that's the reason why they forced it so hard into rule, because it had to be. They were still even scared of changing the rule while it was being implemented for that exact reason.
Mm-hmm. So then I just thought it was interesting when I was going through some newspapers, looking through the Title IX through history. After 1972, you get to see a lot more, like in regards to employment. If you're looking through newspaper records, you see a lot of Title IX is equal employment. Like companies have to start addressing that legally, because it's showing, this Title IX is very relevant, at least in terms of equal employment and the equal opportunities for men and women. I just thought that was interesting because, it started as a feminist issue, especially regarding sports and education, but it became to be, you could still see that on, teacher syllabuses or, anything like regarding any of that, because it is so prevalent today. It's it's become a bigger movement, which I'm sure everyone else can talk on too.
Yeah, and
So
here's an interesting statistic. Since 1972, I took a very big athletic perspective on this, but the number of female high school athletes has grown from about 295,000 to over 3.4 million today, according to NPR.
yeah. So I'm gonna that's kind of the extent of the historical context. I think one of the biggest emphasis I want to put on is just the evolution of how, like I said, starting in the beginning of the 70s, how that rise of feminism took part in the influence of the Title IX, and then how the Title IX evolved through the 70s, 80s, the backlash it had, and against it, and kind of how it evolved into being more of like a federal rule now that like it's common that you would see employment, Title IX employers as an equal employer. I just think that's an interesting point to point out. So.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the impact of Title IX now. So I took a very big athletic perspective on this. Like I said, about the increase of female high school athletes has grown over the past 50-some years. And prior to Title IX, athletic scholarships were reserved exclusively for men. And Title IX now requires that athletic scholarships be awarded in proportion to the number of male and female athletes participating in sports. With that, schools are incentivized to recruit female athletes to maintain compliance with Title IX. This has led to better recruitment practices and support systems for female athletes. And this includes better coaching for them and facilities and academic support. So this doesn't help just like athletically, but it helps them educationally too.
Yeah.
The increased participation and support for women's sports has also led to a greater success at the professional and Olympic levels. Female athletes now have more opportunities to compete and excel and get more recognized for their achievements and their abilities as athletes.
Exactly. It's not an issue today, kind of like the opportunities that people have at the highest level of sports. It's there. If you can think of a lot of sports, there's a professional basketball for the women's. There's lacrosse. There's everything except for, honestly, the NFL is really the only thing that there is not really a professional level. But it's just nice to see that everything kind of at today, there are equal opportunities for women and men when it comes to the Olympic level. So it's a nice thing to not have to worry about, because educationally, we have almost gotten to an equal standpoint with that for women and men. But sports is it's the last thing we're kind of touching on for this Title IX, because there's a little bit of unfairness when it comes to this, crossover in sports and stuff. So
I have something to add on to that. So I think something else that's interesting to note, like kind of some loopholes in the Title IX. So though it's stating for educational opportunities, equal opportunities for men and women, according to NBC Sports, an article from May 27, 2022, there's a statistic that says schools collectively spent $8.7 million more on equipment for men's basketball than for women, and that's a 39% difference. And then another statistic showing that schools spent $19 million more on recruiting for men's basketball programs than for women's, which is a 72% increase as well. Mm-hmm. So now I know Carson and I had this conversation too when I first found this. Though at first it sounds like it's an imbalance due to, gender bias, Carson had a good point that I didn't really think of, is that most of the time, statistically speaking, the viewing rates of at least NCAA basketball for men's is higher.
Exactly. It's the revenue they bring in from not only viewership but attendance. Over the last few years in the NBA, there's been record-breaking, finals performances and playoffs and just attendance-ship in general. Whereas you see the WNBA, there is just not a lot of people at the games. The stadiums are never full. Viewership has honestly been near the same since it's been created. A little bit of an increase, but it just correlates with the time over time. So that really has an effect on it, because when people aren't buying their jerseys, or like they're not getting any revenue to support their salary or the production to come in with that.
Well, I have an interesting statistic here. So in 2016, with the Rio Olympics, the U.S. sent more female athletes than male athletes for the first time ever. I just think that's a very interesting statistic to point out. But I mean, back in 1972, only 90 women out of 428 athletes went and participated.
Yeah.
So I guess it depends on the sports. I guess with the Olympics, it's a wide range of sports.
It does vary based on the sport, yeah. You got anything left for that? All right. So kind of going into leaning into the contemporary issues, current day stuff, a little bit of the future, but so I know Nate and Murphy have a lot of things to chime in on here, because Murph and I went to the Riley Gaines convention together just to see what it was about. Once we figured out we were going to do this final project, and I know Nate will have a lot of talking points with his track background. So Riley Gaines, she was a former Kentucky swimmer. She was amongst the dozen college athletes who filed a lawsuit against the NCAA for violating the Title IX rights by allowing transgender woman Leah Thomas to compete at the national championships in 2022. So at first glance, wasn't a problem. They allowed them in, Leah Thomas. So she had previously competed at the men's level at the University of Pennsylvania for 3 years, where she was ranked 300s to 500s her entire career there as a male. And then she switched to the female competitions and placed first. Beat many Olympians, beat the best of the best, including Riley Gaines, where she was at the time very good. So this all stemmed her issue. Riley Gaines really didn't know who Leah Thomas was until she swam against her. She swam against her in the 200-yard final, where they tied, although Gaines was not awarded the medal. They just gave it to Leah Thomas. Why? There was never a conclusion fully of why. But Gaines said at the convention that it was because of the transgender rights for there and how she argued it. Riley Gaines argued the fact that why Leah Thomas was there, and they did not like that. She got a lot of backlash for it, and she also said as well that in her, correct me if I'm wrong, Murphy, but she said how in the locker room they were complaining about, like, just a little bit unexpected when all the women were getting changed, and then Leah Thomas walked in. There was a lot of, everybody hid, she said, and just like covered themselves. It's just not very natural for them.
Well, I think also what Carson's trying to get at too is that Riley Gaines, this is all coming from her perspective as well, a competitor of Leah Thomas. So this is only a primary source. It, obviously has some bias to it.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest takeaways though is kind of, Leah Thomas, the Title IX being kind of switched its meaning today, especially with transgender rights in sports. Nowadays, they're trying to, which I'm sure Carson can talk more on, is they're trying to switch Title IX into more gender-based rather than sex-based, which is, like I previously stated before, in the actual Title IX statement, it talks about being on the basis of sex rather than gender. So Carson, I think, can speak more onto that.
Yeah, so I have a source here from the E&W blog, the Education and Workforce. Under Biden's administration, he was, in addition to trying to change the sex-based discrimination to gender, which... Yeah, trying to change the sex-based to gender. Yeah, no, you're good. And which would then allow players and competitors like Leah Thomas into the other sport. That he never did get that followed through, so it's not, anything to worry about or focus on today, but there was an attempt to change that, which would have completely changed the outlook and future of NCAA sports.
Yeah, and
sports
I
in general.
agree. And coming just from the historical perspective, the way that I think Title IX is more used today as, I'm trying to think of the word. It's used more as like a thing thrown around, if you support it or not, But really, if you really look at where the root of the Title IX stems from, it's literally to show that there's an educational equality between men and women. So I think that that's also lost a lot of meaning today, because now people are throwing around, Title IX, what does it even mean?
Yeah.
Which I think that it's important to really understand why it was really put in place. And once again, I think it's important to also note how even in contemporary periods, we have similar issues, but definitely different contexts. And I think we try to use history a lot to back that up, but it's not always the right context to use it in. So,
I'll get to the point kind of here on the current day issues, safety. Just scientifically, biologically, men can run faster, they can jump higher, they are just naturally stronger.
Biological, like based on sex.
Based on sex, yeah. So I have a quote here from Serena Williams saying that if she were to play Andy Murray, she would lose 6-0, 6-0 in 5 to 10 minutes. At the time of her saying this, I believe it was in 2020. It was on Facebook. Serena Williams was the number 11 tennis player of the world, and probably she's the best, female tennis player of all time, while Andy Murray was 122nd, and for a 5-year span, he was ranging between the 100s and the high 200s. Why would she say this? It's just because of how it's a different game, right? So having somebody like a biological male play in a female, a women's sport biologically, it's just dangerous. Because I have the average serve speed for a male is 120 miles per hour, while the woman is 105. And for the fastest serve ever, I got 194.4 miles per hour by James Harrison, while Georgina Perez recorded a 136.7 mile per hour serve. That is that almost near 60 miles per hour difference, which could severely harm somebody if they were to switch the sports. And I also have another one here. For the fastest Olympic track runner ever. For female, it is a 10:49 by Florence Joyner, ran in the 1980s, a 100-meter dash, while Divine Ahim, a 14-year-old male, ran a 10.3 100-meter dash in high school. So I've never ran track myself, but Nate here, he's a track runner at his high school and now collegiate level. I'm sure he can tell you a little bit about the difference in levels of, competition between the males and the females.
Yeah, I mean, the disparity is crazy. These women are phenomenal athletes.
Exactly.
But they just can't compete against men.
Mm-hmm.
That's just how it is. They are phenomenal athletes, but
And that's the reason why we have, male and female sports.
Mm-hmm.
It's because there are phenomenal women athletes out there. My sister herself was an athlete in high school, played soccer, flag football, track. She competed at everything, honestly. So there are some great female athletes out there, many of them. And the reason we split the, genders up is because, or sexes up, because it's to give them their own, their own world of sports.
Form of competition.
Give them their own respect. They are top tier athletes at their sports. Mm-hmm. But, that's why we have them in their own sports, because it's just ruining it. Because if people say, compare them to the men, well, they're not men. They're not like the men,
I just want to point out, so obviously these, I think, are conservative viewpoints in today's contemporary society, but to advocate for some more liberal perspectives on this issue. Some people may argue that the allowing, going off, changing the Title IX into more gender-based.
Yeah.
It aligns with the modern modern ideas of gender identity. Not necessarily having to have gender, sex line up all the way. Which once again, I think looking back into the historical perspective is interesting because we don't really see this issue prevalent whenever in 1972 when this was written. So once again, just showing how modern politics or even just viewpoints are influencing historical documents. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, has established guidelines for transgender athletes, which could include hormone therapy requirements to ensure fairness on biological principles. So I think our biggest point is that there are definitely, it's not a black or white issue. It's a very gray area in between.
Yeah.
And I think that, looking in a historical context, I find it interesting. I think I also nerd out on history, but I think it's interesting to watch how, even in just the span of 55 years in that area, we're seeing such huge changes to, I'd say, a pretty recent historical document.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have to say something?
I was going to add to that. That going off, it's all, this whole podcast was supposed to be about the history of it and where we've gone there. But about the future, another kind of non-conservative view on it is, well, if we're going to ban transgender athletes from, the sports that they identify in, what are we going to do? Right? What sports can they compete in? A lot of people just say, don't play sports. Some people say compete in your, sex-based sports, like what you were originally when you were born. But, what could we do for them? Because there are not a lot of, transgender athletes out there in the world. And it's like they can't create their own league. They can't.
An easy answer.
It's not. There's no easy answer. And that could be talked about on another day, another podcast.
Because I also think this may get more into morals. It honestly kind of comes down to, in the case of Riley Gaines, having the, a biological man, a transgender woman, tying with a biological woman in the same sport, tying, one person gets a medal, it's a moral thing. I mean, one person's going to get the medal, one person's not. So It's going to make one half of the opinion, the people who support one opinion, very mad, and it's going to make the others, resent those people. And I think that's, once again, our political climate today. This issue is very controversial. Divisive. Exactly. And I just want to also point out that we are not biased in this podcast. We are just including viewpoints of both sides,
reading off facts and sources that we researched.
Yeah, and so for me, I think we have to get wrapping up here. But for me, like I said, I found out what Title IX really was when I got to Slippery Rock a couple months ago. I've learned a lot about, where it stemmed from and the terms of feminism emerging. I've learned how modern topics are affecting it. I've learned how, it really is something, not to say that the effects of it are, it's definitely a depressing topic to talk about because someone's always going to get upset. But I do think it's interesting. Growing up in history classes, you always hear about how, how history changes over time, but we're literally in the making of new history with this. It's an interesting topic, I think, because there are many loopholes. And, I think that, I really do think that this topic won't have an answer. I don't think you're going to make everyone happy with it. And I think it just will take time with society to really understand what the context is.
Yeah, and if we ever do get an answer, honestly, it's going to be a long time from now. But just, what I learned is, obviously it's all a gray area. There's nothing clear and cut here. There are facts. There's stuff to back certain things up, but it's a lot of morals. And but it was just interesting to see, Title IX, what it really was, and what we have to work on, but also how far we've gotten. There has been a lot of improvement for a lot of people in this world, and I just hope it keeps improving in that way. improving for people, just everybody in general, just, making our world better and our athletes healthier, safest as we can be. And then Nate, if you want to wrap it up.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say. It's a very controversial issue, but we can't let these issues divide us.
Yeah, and I think it's also good, even though this was for a school project, I think we all are educated on the subject, which I think is important with a lot of modern day topics, to really be educated, know where things stem from. And
don't get us wrong, we have a lot to learn still about this. we just touched on, the tip of it, the tip of the iceberg. There is still so much more to learn about it and research to do.
All right, anything else you guys want to talk about? All right, well, thank you for listening.
Yep, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good day.